Consider this situation that comes up in hot market situations. There's a buyer who wants to make the buyer's offer as simple as possible. And one of the ways the buyer does that is while the buyer needs a financing contingency, the buyer doesn't feel the buyer needs an appraisal contingency. That makes the buyer's offer more attractive, perhaps because the buyer has won a bidding war that has bid up the price of the house more than an appraisal based on comparable sales in the past might justify. So a question that has existed under the Colorado contract for years is if this is the universe of considerations that a lender considers in making a loan, and if this is just the narrow issue of appraisal issues, if the contract does not have an appraisal contingency, but the contract still has a financing contingency, can the buyer use appraisal issues as a way of backing out under the financing contingency? And in the 2019 version of the Colorado Real Estate Commission approved contract, the Division of Real Estate has attempted to clarify that ambiguity by inserting language into Section 5 of the contract. Buyer does not have a right to terminate based on the new loan if the objection is based on appraised value or lender requirements. Now, there's going to be two things about implementing this in practice that are going to be very tricky. This goal of this clause is fantastic, but the practical implementation of this will be extraordinarily difficult, not having anything to do with any ambiguity in the language that was drafted. The language is as good as it can be. It's just inherently an ambiguous situation. It's inherently ambiguous for two reasons. One of this is that a lot of what's going on with the loan is going on behind the curtain, if you will, from the seller's perspective. The seller doesn't know why the buyer is objecting. They don't know whether it's appraisal issues. They don't know if it's something other than appraisal issues. They don't know if it's the buyer's dodgy credit, the lack of the availability of the loan program for the lender. So one of the reasons it's going to make this tricky is the seller doesn't have enough information to make good real-time decisions. The other reason, though, is even if we could pull back the curtain, and even if the seller had perfect information on everything that the buyer was considering in pushing the eject button and getting out of the contract, there are some things that both relate to the appraisal and also relate to the loan. An example might be zoning. There might be a property that is a non-conforming use, and that both might affect the value of the property, but it also might affect whether the lender wants to make the loan at all. So it's just hard to surgically remove the appraisal considerations from the whole valuation issues. What do you do? What do you do in response to this ambiguity? This is what you do when you're on the buyer side of the transaction. When you're on the buyer side of the transaction, you insert a loan objection contingency and the appraisal contingency. And you have the objection deadlines be on the exact same deadline. Therefore, the buyer can object based on loan considerations as long as the loan termination deadline is still alive. The buyer can object based on appraisal issues as long as the appraisal objection is still alive. If there's no deadline, if there's no daylight, if there's no difference between those dates, this ambiguity doesn't make much of a difference at all. If you're on the listing side, you need to educate your seller about this inherently ambiguous situation. You need to help your seller understand, look, it doesn't really mean much that the buyer has waived the appraisal contingency because they still have a financing contingency. And if the buyer submits a loan termination, we won't really know whether it's based on the non-appraisal issues or not. Seller, the only way I can protect you from that ambiguity is to counter out the loan termination contingency. In other words, let's make this a contract that doesn't have appraisal, does not have an appraisal contingency, does not have a financing contingency. And your seller says, well, that's great, let's do it. And then you say to your seller, well, the downside of that is it may drive away the buyer. There's no free lunch here. It's an inherently ambiguous situation when a buyer objects, claiming, no, I'm not objecting based on appraisal considerations, I'm objecting based on some other loan considerations. It's a complex world. Be careful out there.